when it comes to film versus game, obviously games are interactive. What challenges does that give you as a composer as to how you actually write your music? Having to write for this interactive medium, thinking about how things are going to branch or crossfade or...
Yeah, well, that's obviously you nail it with even just the phrasing of the question. They are, on the one hand, because they're both very much about characters and story, or at minimum, kind of an experiential sort of atmospheric quality. You know, if we're talking about the most sort of art house, non-narrative film, for example, or game, at very minimum, it's still about a kind of implied narrative, through to very, very specific plotted characters and all that kind of thing. Storytelling is at the forefront of the decisions you're making in both media. So in that sense, they're very similar. But the technique is wildly different as a result. Because, yeah, the interactive elements of games, which I am very passionate about going down the rabbit hole of. You know, Journey was this thing. It unlocked a new dimension of my personality because I realized just how crazy I could get with interactive music. Because it became about, okay, what's the experience I want to make? Now, how the hell do we figure out how to create a system that can do that? As opposed to, here's the system. It's going to be a bass track that adds drums when you're running and then crossfades when such and such thing. And like you're handed the system to compose to. Instead, it was like, let's dream up what the player, like based on our play tests of what the player's behavior is likely to be, let's just see how we can score that to, you know, match in this perfect way. And then just answer the question of what system is needed to match it. In fact, sometimes what I would do is I'd just video capture myself playing the game, and then I'd score a piece of footage and say, okay, how can I make it so that every single time certain things happen, these happen, but then these other things are just kind of cool, happy accidents, and then start to kind of like pull it apart and put it together. But I don't actually these days like to rely on that kind of, because it's still linearizing the process quite a lot.
Do you... Are there certain tricks that you've learned over the years that you always come back to? It's like with me, I really love doing crossfading different stems to increase intensity and stuff. It's a sort of like fail safe. Really like doing it. Have you got something that you sort of like it's your fallback, or you always end up sneaking it in? Like, again, if you're a sound designer, a favorite sound effect you always.
Yeah, exactly, like the Wilhelm, which at this point is in bad taste, I think, but. But yes, for me, there's a few things that are very useful time and again. One of them, I'm a big fan of, I've never thought of a good and visual analogy. The only thing I can ever think of is, you know, the little number lock combos on luggage where you have you know, your row of numbers, and then you can see kind of hidden partially at an angle above and below the kind of higher and lower number. I've often conceived of cues in a structure similar to that, where you have a base cue, which would be like this set of numbers facing you. And then if you scroll one, it's kind of combining that with another cue, or you tilt it the other way, but you can't have it both. You have to choose one. Yeah. So it's basically a cue that has a central foundation and then additive layers, but they're not sort of globally additive. Because sometimes you're told, you know, write a cue and then can break it into constituent elements, and then they can be recombined in any possible combination. Yeah. But I'm not a fan of that because, I mean, sometimes that is the right choice, but in general, I'm often not a fan of that, because what it means is the more generic and less perspective driven the music is, the more effective it is in that kind of environment, because you're just mixing and matching all these different elements. And so I like things that have a little bit of a stronger opinion on what's going on in the game, where certain combinations, they don't work, they can't work. And so I end up doing that trick on most every game, where you could almost think of it like a Y, where there's the sort of vertical base that's always there, and then you end up either here or there, or sometimes there's multiple, it's like a Y with a lot of tree branches.
A tree.
And also known as a tree. And that becomes sort of your approach, where you're creating cues that have constituent elements that are actually mutually exclusive of each other. And the other thing that's funny is that sometimes less interactivity actually is more, because if a scene is compelling and the music is kind of telling a parallel narrative, and sometimes you'll drop like a 2-minute loop with no stems, no layers, no anything. Sometimes not even a loop, just it plays, and then it's done. And the player will have all these individual proprietary moments. Like the moment I put my foot down, the French horns came in. Well, that was completely by chance, but they're convinced that that was by design and they love it. But then somebody else was jumping off the stage when the French horns came in, and that was for them how that moment was supposed to be. And the funny thing is that's how quite a few games were in a prior era, where the technology, like you think of a lot of the Final Fantasy games, for example, where so many of the cues are just like 4, 5, 6 minute loops that just do nothing but sit there and play.
Yeah.
And then people have these extremely emotionally kind of intense associations with them, with their specific playthrough, not realizing that it's wildly different than other people's playthroughs, which is the opposite of Journey. Journey is trying to be like this wizard looking over your shoulder, making you have a very kind of designed experience. And that can be quite fun too. And we leaned a lot on Assassin's Creed, in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, of realizing that if we invest in the integrity of the music and we don't mind it trailing by a second or two out of sync with the player, like we are less ultra tight down to the nanosecond of our interactivity, that they may actually walk away with the same impression. So for me, it's like one of the interactive elements we play with is the degree of interactivity itself, which is, you know, kind of a brain twister. But the other thing it's worth mentioning is that we don't know what the hell we're doing as an industry. And that's exciting. We're still in such infancy of this art form. To me, I always liken it to movies in the 30s and 40s. You know, I mean, of course, a few real genuine classics had been made. You know, you had your Wizard of Oz, you had your Citizen Kane and Casablanca. But there were some major milestones still ahead. There was no Hitchcock, you know, there was no Spielberg, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, anyone who would regard the high point of cinema as in the 1930s or 40s is just being curmudgeonly at this point. Likewise, I think that all of the best of games lies ahead. You know, there's probably a few that will endure over time as early kind of important games. But I think that it's still so young, and that's exciting. So all these techniques we're talking about could easily be out of date. Yeah. Especially as we start getting into something really excites me is the frontier of blending procedural music with AI. And the idea of being able to, where the composer becomes more like an author of algorithms more than what you would traditionally define as a composer, or at least combining those, because there you get into a whole new range of possibilities, and it's really exciting to me.
Yeah. So I just want to talk about one thing briefly before you go on and do your performance, which is about the performance. How did you two...
How incredibly apropos.
Yeah. How did you two start working together?
So the half of you two is Angela Bermudez, who's sitting up here and will join us in a moment. So we first met she lives in Costa Rica. I live in Los Angeles. And about 2 years ago, Sony Santa Monica retweeted this unbelievably amazing photo of someone cosplaying as the Journey character in sand dunes in Egypt. That was like, it looked better than the game. I mean, it was...
I've seen it.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. And, you know, like every time something like that would crop up, you know, a great cover, like I mentioned, you know, Kristen, who did this cover, and I reached out. I'm like, I want to know you. And there have been a couple people who made fan art, like beautiful paintings or whatnot, where I reached out. It's like, I just want to know. Someone's really creative, and they've taken the time to make this sort of homage to something I was a part of. And it's really meaningful to me. I want to know more about that person. What drove them to do that? And so I was blown away, and I started messaging. And I remember I sent a message that said, you know, I'd love to mail you an album or something just to show my, I don't know if that even means anything to you, but it's like this is so amazing. This is such beautiful work. And then I found out she had made this outfit like in 10 minutes before the flight, practically. I mean, it was a last second thing done before flying to Egypt to do like a Comic-Con type convention. And she had been doing a lot of cosplay and very well known, especially throughout Central and South America. And so then one day, we became friends. We just would message every now and again, and hey, how's it going? What's going on with you? And sharing just, you know, stuff that's going on in life. And then sometime a couple months later, I see a video of her in a gallery or a space of some kind, and it's this time lapse of her making this amazing, this perfect combination of beautiful and nerdy portrait of Darth Vader. And it's like a 90-second or something video in a time lapse of about a 30-minute period in front of people. Yep. And I thought, I had spent a lot of time, especially in my early 20s, with a painter who was my cousin, who lived in New York. She's no longer with us, I'm afraid, but incredibly powerfully influential person on my life and my outlook on art. And she was this very spiritual painter, and there was a very emotional sensibility to what she did, and that really informed everything about my music today. I mean, I met her when I was 18. But I always would, and I watched her paint, and it would sometimes take weeks to create a single work on a canvas of this size, shrouded in darkness. Spoiler about what's about to happen. And so I saw this time lapse, and it completely blew my mind, because I thought paintings take weeks. I've seen that. How on earth is this possible in a 30-minute period? And she said, well, it's speed painting. It is what it is. And I thought, well, there's probably a show in this. And I was also just eager for any excuse to meet in person, because she was such an inspiring artist. And I was going through all kinds of hell in my personal life, and she became this anchor for me as well, and kind of, in not trivial terms, sort of saved my life. And so this event rolled around called the Music and Games Festival about 1.5 years ago. And they asked me, we had done Journey live there the year before. We did the whole game as a live staged event where players were playing the game, and we recreated the score 100% acoustically, interactively, exactly as an entire playthrough. And we've been touring that all over. And so this festival said, we'd love to have you back. What do you want to do? And I pitched them this idea where I said, what if I play music and we get some other players and we speed paint in front of the audience? And I said, what if it's also entirely improvised, where we have no idea what's going to happen, both painting and music of any kind? And of course, I don't even know if I discussed this with Angela yet. I just kind of threw this out there and volunteered her. And they said, great, we'll do it. And so we met for the first time in Washington, D.C., and just basically I sat at the piano, she stood at the canvas, and it's like, we're going to tell a story, but collaboratively and with no words, and where we have no idea what the story is. And so then we later called it dialogues in Spanish. And we've been doing it all over the world now, and all different kinds of formats. And we are experimenting with all kinds of things. Like, we've been talking to voice actor friends about the idea of there being an improvised narrator who's giving their interpretation of what's going on. And then we've also tried it, like, we're doing it in Poland next week, or in a few days, with Tina Guo, the cellist from Journey. She's also a spectacular improviser, and so we're going to play together as well, along with a flute player named Sarah Andon. And so, yeah, it's just this wonderful and terrifying way to make yourself vulnerable to a very, very forgiving audience. It's an exploration of pure creativity and storytelling is the idea. And it actually altered forever my thinking of what music can be, because music was so much about writing and not about my own on-the-fly performance. I'm not a fan of improvising as a compositional technique, for example. I don't just sit piano and play and then pull ideas out. It's more methodical than that usually. And so this kind of just loosened me up and made me realize music can be experiential, but what if also painting is experiential? We're all used to going to art galleries or museums or looking online at portfolios or whatever, and you see a painting as a finished piece, but it's well, what if the painting is not about the finished piece? It's about what you go through to get there. It's a completely new way to look at painting also. So, when I suggested that we try that here, to my shock, they said yes. So is that of interest to you fine folks here? Are you interested in seeing us vulnerably put ourselves at your feet and create on the fly? Okay, kind of had me nervous there for a second.
Cool. So before that, are we going to audience questions first?
We'll start right here, I guess.
Hi.
Hi.
You don't need me to say that you've done an incredible amount of work, and what we had here has been something spectacular. Being that diverse, and you've worked in such kind of different jobs, is there something that you currently wake up and you think, shit, I would like to do something like this?
Yes, definitely. So a month ago, I did a Kickstarter for a project called A Light in the Void, which is basically a evening-length theatrical symphony orchestra concert that's about colliding science education and a science appreciation with music. And that was one of those things where science is my biggest love outside of music. And I said, I want to do a show that no one's ever going to really hire me to do, but I want to basically talk about science through music, with real scientists, not science teachers or science educator like Bill Nye type people. I want the people who are actually making these breakthroughs to come join me on stage. So I pitched this gargantuanly, stupidly huge idea, and the Colorado Symphony in the U.S. said, "We'll do it." And then I managed to convince a couple thousand people or 1,500 people or something to give me like $100,000 on Kickstarter to seed this thing. And it's literally like me and Angela is part of this project, and I'm working with a filmmaker to help craft the narrative. And we'll have like the Large Hadron Collider senior experiment designer will be one of our scientists. We have the Cassini probe lead imaging scientist, the probe that just recently dove into Saturn's atmosphere after a 15-year mission heading out there and orbiting. And so this is one of those things that I had a lot of ideas, and there was no job for them. It was its own thing, and had to do it. And thank God we live in an era of the internet and Kickstarter that I actually get to do this. Coming to Twitch October 5th. I'm nothing if not shameless, apparently. So yes, that's one. There's a lot of others. Angela and I have a lot of other kind of pet projects that are entirely non-commercial and that sort of thing. And I also just write concert music sometimes for myself.
Okay.
Any other stragglers?
One more, I think.
One more.
I know we talked too long.
I have this problem often.
Thank you very much.
I didn't even know there'd be an audience here. I thought we were just chatting.
In the Banner Saga, you've obviously got themes for different characters, so Juno and Eyvind. Did you find that you were tying specific instruments to specific moments as well, such as with Eyvind on the tower, the bridge, other moments? You have the electric guitar coming through.
Yeah, the weird prepared electric guitar from a guy named Viking Jesus. There's just so many wonderful stories of the Banner Saga. He sawed a guitar in half, and we made an instrument out of that tragic sound. Not really, actually. Funny enough, there are certain instruments I associate with certain characters, but it's mainly all expressed by the time of the third game. Like you just heard, that weird amalgamation of wind instruments that you hear playing the Juno Eyvind theme a number of times. We don't hear that combination playing outside of that, so that's an example. And the prepared electric guitar is something I associate, and didgeridoo is something I associate with the kind of stone metal villain type characters called the Dredge. But otherwise, I paint relatively equally across the board, which is unusual. Usually I like to tie specific instruments to characters very dogmatically. Like in Assassin's Creed, the violin is Jacob Fry, the cello is Evie Fry, always, that kind of thing.
Actually, we do have one more question.
Yes. All right. Who feels the mantle of responsibility? I like how you go, eh. That's conviction. I love it. We also only made it in the first two rows.
Thanks very much. I was just wondering, have you played anything where you thought, boy, I really wish I'd been a part of that, either from a musical perspective or just from a kind of a technical execution, like how the music followed the gameplay or anything like that?
It's funny. I've been asked that question actually quite a few times, and generally speaking, no, because when I really love a game, almost always part of why I really love it is its score, and the idea of wanting to write my own is by definition making it lesser than it is. I mean, my go-to example for that is always BioShock. Gary Scheinman is the composer of that franchise, a very good friend of mine, and I think he wrote landmark scores for those games. And I adore them. And the idea of saying, boy, I wish I'd done BioShock, is to actually wish BioShock to be less than it is. And I don't want that. My ultimate favorite sort of game score ever is Grim Fandango, and that's the same thing. Like I would actively detract from Grim Fandango if I had written that score. The only thing even remotely close to this that I could offer is that another one of my very all-time favorites is the Mass Effect franchise. And there's a lot of music in those games that I really love, but it was kind of a technical mess. And they would be the first to say, I mean, that was a really challenging game. It's a huge scope relative to its budget, especially the first game. And so they had a kind of unwinnable situation of needing a lot of content but didn't have infinite resources to produce it. I mean, they just didn't. So there are a lot of compromises that really shone to me, that drove me nuts as a player who happens to also kind of understand the audio tech. And I don't really consider it their fault, but it was one of those that did drive me insane while I was playing the game. even though I still resulted in loving it. But the translation of that isn't, therefore I wish I had done it, like I'm some savior that's going to come in and fix their game. They did an amazing job under the circumstances. But there are occasional moments where I'm like, find myself thinking, you know, I wonder how I would have handled that or something. But it's not, it doesn't go so far as wishing I had. To me, the best jobs are the ones that I never saw coming. They have no precedent. They're not me trying to figure out how to step into someone else's shoes or something like that, where I get to play and experiment. And so existing, I mean, obviously Assassin's Creed is an existing franchise. I also did a Leisure Suit Larry game. That's an existing franchise. I just finished a game I can't talk about yet, but that's also from an existing franchise. And I enjoy that a lot. But to me, the blank slates are the real exciting thing. The journeys, the Abzus, the Banner Sagas. So yeah, I don't really envy. In fact, I'll go even farther as to say, not only do I not really envy my composer friends and colleagues in that way, but one of my favorite things is celebrating what they do. I mean, Jessica Curry, who I'm sure hope all of you are at the concert tomorrow night, here as well. Royal Phil doing PlayStation in concert. Jess will be hosting that, and she wrote Dear Esther, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, So Let Us Melt, Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs. All great scores, truly superb. I think she's one of the greatest composers and artists that I know, that I can imagine. And I don't look at her jobs and say, oh, damn, I wish I had scored that. I'm like, I feel goddamn lucky to live in a world where she made that thing and I get to play it.
Right, on that note, could we give Austin a big hand?
Thank you.
So I think I'm right in saying...
Wait. And for Adele for so graciously dealing with me.
Thank you.
Right, please.